The two F-16 appeared out of nowhere. They came in low and fast from the northeast banking, hard to match the speed of the commercial jet pulling alongside it, with the kind of precision that only exists in training exercises or genuine emergencies. Their gray fuselages caught the afternoon sun over the Illinois flatlands. Their pilots said nothing on open channels. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything that needed saying. Inside the cockpit of Flight 282, a girl sat in the first officer's seat. She was 17 years old. Her hands were on the yoke of a Boeing 737. Two unconscious pilots were behind her. 147 people were breathing recycled air in the cabin at her back. 30,000 feet below the city of Chicago was getting closer by the second. Her name was Sara Cole, and 4 hours earlier she had been just another teenager at an airport hoping her flight wouldn't be delayed. Denver International Airport, 6:47 in the morning. The terminal was doing what terminals do, absorbing the noise and weight of hundreds of separate lives, all of them converging on the same place at the same time, none of them particularly interested in anyone else. Coffee cups and carry-ons, gate announcements, and the low-grade anxiety of early morning travel. The kind of ordinary that you only notice once it's gone. Sara Cole sat at gate C11 with her backpack between her feet and her eyes on the floor. She was small for 17. Dark hoodie, worn jeans, the kind of quiet that isn't shyness, it's the quiet of someone carrying something heavy enough that they've stopped spending energy on anything that doesn't matter. She was flying alone for the first time since her father died. That fact sat on her chest like a stone she'd gotten used to the weight of, but couldn't quite put down. Her mother had walked her to security. They hadn't said much. There wasn't much left to say that words were adequate for. At the checkpoint, Ellen Cole had reached into her coat pocket and taken out a small pair of silver wings, Air Force wings, the kind they pin on a man's chest when he earns the right to call the sky his office. They were worn at the edges. The silver had gone soft in places where fingers had touched it too many times. Ellen held them for a moment. Then she reached out and pinned them to Sarah's hoodie just above the left pocket. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. They both knew whose wings they were. Sara looked down at them, pressed her fingers against the metal. Cold at first, then warm. She picked up her bag and walked through the checkpoint without looking back because she knew that if she looked back, she would see her mother trying not to come apart, and she couldn't afford that, not today. Not at an airport at 6 in the morning with a flight to catch and a long way to go before she could let herself fall apart too. She found her gate, sat down, put her bag between her feet, stared at the floor. In the backpack between a water bottle and a folded denim jacket was a book. Not a textbook, not a novel. It was a flight manual for the Cessna 172 Skyhawk spiral-bound, its cover warped from years of handling, its pages thick with handwriting in the margins. Notes in blue ink, careful and precise. The handwriting of a man who believed that if something was worth knowing, it was worth writing down properly. Captain Daniel Cole, United States Air Force, had given Sara that manual when she was 10 years old. He'd set it on the kitchen table one Saturday morning, slid it across to her without ceremony, and said, "Read this." Not as a suggestion. The way a pilot gives a pre-flight checklist, matter-of-fact, expected non-negotiable. She had read it, then read it again. And on Sunday mornings when the weather was right and his schedule allowed, he had taken her flying. Not in military aircraft, in a small rented Cessna at a private airfield 40 minutes east of Denver. He'd sit in the left seat and she'd sit in the right, and he'd walk her through everything. Airspeed and altitude, trim and throttle, how to read the sky, the way other people read faces for intention, for change, for what it was about to do next. He wasn't teaching her to be a pilot. He was giving her something he couldn't name but understood instinctively, a way of thinking. A habit of staying steady when the instruments are screaming and your gut is louder than both. He used to say, when everything around you goes wrong, you are still the calmest voice in that sky. You do your job. You bring it home. She used to roll her eyes at that. The way teenagers do when their parents say something they already know is true, but aren't ready to admit yet. She wasn't rolling her eyes anymore. Captain Daniel Cole died 22 months ago. Not in a cockpit, not in service. He died on a Tuesday night in November on a rain-wet 2-lane highway outside of Littleton, Colorado. A drunk driver crossed the center line at 63 miles an hour. The physics of it were brutal and final. There is a particular cruelty to losing someone the wrong way. To losing a man built for the sky to something as small and stupid and preventable as a Tuesday night in the rain. Sara had spent 22 months learning to live inside that particular cruelty. What she hadn't told anyone, not her mother, not her school counselor, not the grief therapist she'd seen 3 times before stopping, was the other thing. The thing that lived underneath the grief like a second wound. She was the one who had asked him to drive that night. She'd needed a ride. The details were ordinary: a school event, a broken down car, a phone call made without thinking, the way you call your father when you need something, because of course he'll come, he always comes. He'd said sure and picked up his keys. 22 months later, she was still sleeping with that fact pressed against her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. She reached into her backpack and touched the spine of the Cessna manual, ran her thumb along the edge, felt the familiar worn groove where the cover had been bent back too many times. Over the gate speakers, a voice announced that Flight 282 to Chicago was beginning general boarding. Sarah picked up her bag and got in line. Row 17, window seat. She stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her, buckled in, and turned to look out the window at the gray Denver morning. Ground crews moved equipment across the tarmac. A fuel truck pulled away from the wing. She pressed her fingers to the silver wings on her hoodie. Just checking. 3 rows ahead in seat 12, a man named Ray Holt settled in with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had started requiring consultation before major movements. He was 62 years old, broad-shouldered the way that men get when they've been broad-shouldered their whole lives and the muscle has gone softer, but the frame remains. He had a short gray beard and eyes the color of old pavement, observant, unhurried, the kind of eyes that had spent decades watching radar screens and had gotten very good at noticing things that weren't where they were supposed to be. Ray Holt had spent 30 years as an air traffic controller for the FAA, Chicago Center mostly, sometime at Denver Tricon early in his career. He had guided aircraft through thunderstorms, equipment failures, medical emergencies, and the particular controlled chaos of holiday travel. He had talked to thousands of pilots in thousands of situations and maintained a near-perfect record. He had retired 3 years ago. His wife had said he seemed lost for the first 6 months, and she was right. He was going to Chicago this week to see his daughter and her family. His first grandchild was 8 months old and had recently discovered the ability to laugh, and Ray wanted to be there for as much of that as possible. He pulled out a copy of Aviation Week the way he always did on flights, because old habits are the ones that stick. He didn't notice Sara Cole yet, but he would. 2 rows up and across the aisle in seat 8B, Warren Cross was on his phone. He was 58 years old, well-dressed in the way people are when they've spent enough money on clothes that looking put together has become automatic. A commercial real estate developer out of Denver, successful by every conventional measure, accustomed to being the most capable person in whatever room he occupied. He carried that assumption the way other people carry a credit card, reflexively, without much thought about whether it was actually warranted. He was in the middle of a negotiation he couldn't afford to lose. He'd deal with Chicago when he landed. Right now, he needed to get off the ground and think. Near the front in row 6 sat Garrett Bowe. He was 54, built like a man who had spent 20 years lifting things that didn't want to be lifted and carrying people who couldn't carry themselves. Retired from the Chicago Fire Department 4 years ago, a torn rotator cuff having made the decision easier than it might have been otherwise. He was quiet in the way that men who have seen real emergencies are quiet, not because there's nothing to say, but because he had learned long ago to save energy for when it actually mattered. He was reading a paperback thriller he wasn't particularly invested in. He was the kind of man who would be useful in a crisis. He didn't know that yet. At the front of the cabin, Colette Marsh ran through her pre-departure checklist with the efficiency of someone who had done this more times than she could count. 12 years as a flight attendant, the last 4 as lead. Composed, quick, possessed of the particular skill the best flight attendants develop, the ability to read the emotional temperature of a cabin full of strangers in about 90 seconds. She glanced back down the aisle. A girl alone in row 17, window seat, young, flying alone by the look of it. Something about the way she sat, not tense exactly, but careful, like someone used to managing something on her own. Colette noted it and moved on. In the cockpit, Captain Alan Reeves and First Officer Marcus Nash completed their pre-flight checks and received clearance from Denver ground. Reeves was a 20-year veteran with the airline, methodical and unhurried. Nash was newer, 7 years, solid record. The conversation was professional, sparse. Everything was normal. Everything was completely, unremarkably normal. The door closed, the jetway pulled back, Flight 282 pushed away from the gate at 7:14 in the morning, 12 minutes behind schedule, which was close enough to on time to satisfy almost everyone aboard. Sarah pressed her forehead to the cold window and watched Denver fall away beneath her. 30,000 feet is where the sky changes. Below that altitude, even at cruising height, there is still a sense of connection to the ground. You can see the shape of things, cities, rivers, the geometry of farmland. But at 30,000 feet on a clear morning, the earth below becomes abstract, a pattern, a map of itself. The sky around you is a shade of blue that doesn't exist at ground level. something between sapphire and infinity, and the light has a quality that makes everything feel suspended. Sarah had noticed this the first time her father took her up. The way height simplified things. The way problems that felt enormous on the ground became from up here, merely part of a larger picture. She was thinking about that, about how different things look from altitude when the cabin lights flickered. Just once, a half-second stutter, like a power surge, and then steady again. She straightened, pulled her earbuds out. Around her, a few passengers glanced up. Most didn't. The man in 17A looked up from his newspaper, looked back down. A child 2 rows ahead hadn't noticed at all. Sarah noticed. She had 360 hours in flight simulators and approximately 40 hours in actual aircraft. She was not a pilot, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her to pay attention to the sky the way a doctor pays attention to a patient, looking not just at what's obvious, but at what's slightly off, what the instruments are telling you that your eyes haven't caught up to yet. The lights flickered again, shorter, almost imperceptible. She looked toward the front of the cabin. Colette Marsh was in the forward galley, her back half-turned, pressing her earpiece. Her body language was controlled, professional, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed. The practiced ease was replaced by something more deliberate, more careful. Colette pressed the earpiece again, tapped it. Nothing from the cockpit, no response on the interphone. She crossed to the cockpit door with the measured speed of someone moving quickly while trying not to look like they're moving quickly. She knocked, 3 times firm. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The cabin had gone quieter in the way cabins do when collective unconscious attention shifts without anyone deciding to shift it. Conversations lowered. A few people looked toward the front. The engines continued steady and indifferent. Colette picked up the interphone handset, pressed the button for the cockpit, waited. The small green indicator light that should have lit up remained dark. She turned, made eye contact with the second flight attendant. The second attendant disappeared toward the rear of the aircraft. Ray Holt had lowered his magazine. He was watching the forward galley with the attention of a man who spent 30 years parsing the difference between a situation and an emergency. He watched Colette knock on that door a 3rd time, watched her face, watched the way she set her jaw when there was still no answer. He set the magazine in the seat pocket. Warren Cross was still on his phone. Garrett Bowe had looked it up from his book. Sara Cole watched Colette Marsh with absolute stillness, scanning the way her father had taught her, reading everything at once. The second flight attendant returned from the rear, carrying a silver case marked in red letters, Emergency Access. It held oxygen equipment, emergency tools, and a key card for the cockpit door override, the kind of thing you use when all other options are exhausted. In 12 years, Colette Marsh had never had to use it. She used it now. The door opened. What it revealed was the thing no amount of training fully prepares you for, because training gives you procedures, and procedures require a mind still capable of executing them calmly. And what Colette saw when that door swung open hit the animal part of her brain before the professional part had a chance to catch up. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, motionless. The cockpit smelled faintly of something chemical, something that didn't belong. The instrument panels glowed steady and indifferent. The autopilot light burned a calm, unblinking green. The sky outside the cockpit windows was enormous and blue and completely empty. Colette grabbed the frame of the door to steady herself, pressed her hand over her nose. Then she pushed the door fully open and called back down the cabin, "Get oxygen up, here." Now, the next 4 minutes were controlled chaos. Colette and the second attendant got emergency oxygen masks onto both pilots. Still breathing, both of them pulses present, but unresponsive and showing no signs of coming around. The cockpit had been sealed with a slow gas accumulation for how long they didn't know. Long enough. In the cabin, the news moved the way bad news always moves, in enclosed spaces, in fragments and whispers, in the faces of people who were trying to decide whether what they were feeling was justified. A man in row 10 stood up. Colette asked him to sit. He sat. Warren Cross ended his phone call. Garrett Bowe bookmarked his page. Ray Holt stood up. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided to do something, not just react to something. He walked forward, identified himself to Colette in a low voice, former FAA air traffic controller, 30 years Chicago Center, and she stepped back to let him look. He stood in the cockpit doorway for 80 seconds. He looked at the instrument panel, the autopilot display, the heading indicator, the altitude, read out the fuel gauges, the engine monitoring screens. He looked at the throttle quadrant and the flap controls and the radio stack. He processed all of it with the methodical fluency of a man who had spent 3 decades interpreting exactly this kind of data from the other side of the radio. He knew what all of it meant. He could not make it do what it needed to do. 80 seconds. Then he stepped back out of the cockpit and turned around. The nearest passengers were watching him, relief already forming in their faces. The older man with the experienced face had gone in there. He would fix it. That's how this was supposed to work. Ray Holt looked at those faces and felt the weight of what he had to say next settle onto him like something physical. He said it anyway. I know how to talk to a pilot. I've done it 100,000 times, but I don't know how to be one. I cannot fly this aircraft. The silence that followed had texture. Warren Cross from row 8 said so. We're just going to die up here. It wasn't quite a question or question. Ray didn't answer. He turned back toward the cabin scanning, and that was when he saw her. Row 17, the girl in the dark hoodie. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted the way the others had. No visible panic, no reaching for the person next to her, no hands white-knuckling the armrests. She was sitting with a worn, spiral-bound book in her lap, watching him with gray eyes that were doing something he recognized immediately because he had spent 30 years looking for it in the voices of pilots mid-emergency. She was assessing, not panicking, not freezing, taking inventory. Ray Holt walked back down the aisle and stopped at row 17. He looked at the book in her hands, the Cessna 172 manual, notes in the margins, old notes, not hers, handwriting belonging to someone else. He said, "What do you know about that cockpit?" The cabin was listening. Every passenger who could hear him was listening. Colette Marsh had come partway down the aisle and stopped. Sara Cole looked down at the book in her hands, at the handwriting in the margins, at her father's precise, careful notes written when she was 10, when she was 12, when she was 15, written across years of Sunday mornings and clear skies, and a man who believed that knowledge was the one thing you could give a person that no one could take away. She looked up at Ray Holt. She said enough not to make it worse. He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. In 30 years of air traffic control, he had learned to read competence the way other people read weather, not from any single indicator, but from the pattern of everything at once. The voice, the cadence, the specific gravity of what someone says versus what they leave out. He made a decision. He stepped back from the row and said quietly and without drama, words that would be repeated in congressional testimony, in accident reports, in news coverage for years afterward. Then you're going up there. I'll be right here. I'll be your ears. You'll be the hands. We bring this plane down together. Sara didn't move for a moment. She looked at the silver wings on her hoodie. The wings her mother had pinned there that morning, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say that words were good for. The wings that had spent 20 years on her father's chest before spending the last 22 months in a box in the closet of a house in Denver, where a woman and her daughter were slowly learning to live inside an absence. She thought about her father's voice. That particular level, absolutely unimpressed by drama voice he used in the simulator when the instruments were screaming and she was 10 years old and terrified. She closed the Cessna manual. She put it carefully in the seat pocket in front of her. She unbuckled her seatbelt, and she stood up. 147 people watched a 17-year-old girl walk up the aisle of a commercial airliner toward the open cockpit door. Some prayed. Some were too frightened to do anything at all. A child near the front pressed his face into his mother's arm. Garrett Bowe in row 6 watched her pass. He had been a firefighter for 20 years. He had seen people make the decision to run toward things instead of away from them more times than he could count, and he knew what it looked like, and he knew how rare it was. He recognized it now in the straight-back, deliberate walk of a girl who was probably terrified and doing it anyway. He didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Warren Cross watched her go and felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest, something he didn't have a name for and wasn't ready to examine. Ray Holt walked behind Sara at a distance, turned at row 12, picked up the interphone handset, and confirmed it was still live to the cockpit circuit. It was. He would be able to hear everything. He would be able to speak to her. He would not be able to fly the plane. She would have to do that. Sara stepped into the cockpit. The first thing she noticed was the smell, the faint chemical trace still hanging in the recycled air. Something wrong underneath the familiar cockpit smell of instrument panels and pressurized air. The emergency oxygen masks had been placed on the pilots. Both men were still in their seats, heads slightly forward, breathing audible and slow but completely unresponsive. The second thing she noticed was the instrument panel, larger than any simulator she had sat before. Not alien, not incomprehensible, but denser and more present than any screen had prepared her for. Screens render a cockpit at a remove. This was the actual cockpit. This was the real thing. The altitude readout showing 30,000 feet. The heading indicator on 085. Airspeed steady. The autopilot annunciator panel glowing green, a P active. Nav hold engaged. She had maybe 15 seconds of genuine vertigo. Pure reasonable vertigo because she was 17 years old and 147 people were behind her, and the two men who were supposed to be here were unconscious. 15 seconds. Then she sat down in the first officer's seat. She adjusted it forward 2 notches, found the rudder pedals, put her feet on them, put her hands on the yoke, felt the weight of it, the live, real, substantial weight of actual flight controls connected to actual wings in actual air, and let out a slow breath. She scanned the panel. Not staring, scanning, the way her father had taught her. Autopilot active, altitude 30,000 feet, heading 085, speed 430 knots. Fuel good, both engines stable. No red warnings on either engine display. She reached for the headset, settled it over her ears, found the transmit button on the yoke. She pressed it. Her voice when it came was not the voice of someone who was not afraid. It was the voice of someone who was afraid and had decided the fear was not relevant to the next thing she needed to do. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 282. Pilots are unconscious. I am a passenger in the cockpit. I have flight simulation experience in small aircraft, requesting immediate assistance on all frequencies. She released the button. Listened to static. She looked down at the silver wings on her hoodie, pressed 2 fingers against them, found the emergency frequency on the radio stack. Switched to it, transmitted again, and this time the static broke. Flight 282, this is Chicago Center. Identify and say your situation. Sara Cole closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them, put her hand back on the yoke, and began to talk. 30,000 feet. The autopilot light burned steady green. For now. Flight 282, this is Chicago Center. Go ahead. The voice came through the headset, clear and professional, not warm exactly, but steady. The kind of steady that is a choice, not an accident. Sara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. My name is Sara Cole. I'm a passenger. I'm 17 years old. I'm in the first officer's seat. Both pilots are unconscious. Autopilot is active, heading 085, altitude 30,000 feet. I have simulation experience in single-engine aircraft. I need instructions. She released the transmit button and waited. The pause lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Then copy that, Flight 282. My name is Desmond Falk. I'm a senior controller at Chicago Center, and I am not going anywhere. You are not alone up there. I need you to confirm a few things. Can you do that? Yes. Look at your autopilot panel. Tell me what lights are active. She scanned it. The layout was different from the simulator she knew, but not unrecognizable. Her father had shown her photographs of commercial cockpit panels, once walking her through the logic of how they were organized. Not because she'd ever need to fly one, he'd said, because understanding the logic of any instrument panel makes you better at reading all of them. Autopilot active, nav hold engaged, altitude hold, speed hold, all green. Good, that's exactly where we want it. The autopilot is flying the plane and it is doing its job. Your job for the next few minutes is to not touch anything you don't have to touch. Eyes on the instruments. Talk to me. Can you do that? Yes. Good. Is there anyone in the cabin with flying experience? Any pilot, flight, instructor, military aviator? She thought of Ray Holt. She keyed the transmit button. There's a former air traffic controller in the cabin. 30 years. FAA. He's on the interphone. Copy that. That's useful. But right now, Sara, I'm talking to you. You're the one in that seat. Are you injured? Any smell of smoke? No smoke. There's a faint chemical smell in the cockpit, but the door is open and it's clearing. Both pilots are breathing. They have oxygen masks. Okay, we believe you're dealing with a slow carbon monoxide accumulation from the cockpit air system. It built up over the past hour or more. With the door open and cabin air circulating, you're not in danger where you are. Understood, understood. Here is what I need you to know right now. Hear this clearly. You are flying a Boeing 737-800. It is a stable aircraft. It is designed to fly. Autopilot is working. You have fuel for 2.5 more hours. We have cleared the airspace around you. No traffic within 40 miles. You have time. We are going to use it carefully. Do you understand everything I just said? Sara's hands were in her lap. She had not touched the yoke since the initial check. Altitude steady, heading steady, speed steady, the autopilot doing exactly what it was built to do. I understand. Good. Now let's talk about what comes next. Ray Holt had been a controller long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in any emergency is not the emergency itself. It's the gap between what a person knows and what they think they know. He had talked people through equipment failures in mountain passes, zero visibility, approaches, unexpected wind shear on final. He had heard every flavor of panic and every flavor of false calm, and he knew the difference between them the way a musician knows the difference between a note played correctly and a note played almost correctly. What he heard coming through the interphone from the cockpit was neither. Sara Cole's voice was precise. She answered questions with facts. She didn't elaborate when elaboration wasn't useful. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answers to. She confirmed, reported, and waited for the next instruction with the economy of someone who understood that in a radio call, every extra word is a code word. She sounded like a pilot, not a trained commercial pilot, not someone with thousands of hours and a certificate from the FAA, but someone who had been taught to think like one. Someone who had learned that the job is not about heroism or bravado, it is about procedure, about doing the next right thing, then the next one, then the next. Breaking an enormous problem into a sequence of manageable steps and executing them in order. He sat in 12A with the interphone handset pressed to his ear and felt something he hadn't expected. He felt relieved, not safe, not confident the outcome would be good. Genuinely relieved the way you are when you realize the person holding the wheel knows how to hold the wheel. Behind him, the cabin was doing what cabins do when information is incomplete and imagination fills the gap. People had heard enough to understand that the pilots were incapacitated. They had seen a 17-year-old girl walk into the cockpit. The flight attendants were moving through the aisle, keeping voices low, projecting the specific competence that says we have a plan, even when the plan is still being assembled. Colette Marsh had made one announcement. Brief, factual, stripped of drama. There is a situation with the flight crew that we are addressing with the support of air traffic control. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We will update you as we are able. That announcement bought them about 6 minutes of cooperative stillness. Then Warren Cross stood up. He didn't make a scene. He was smart enough to know that a scene requires an audience willing to be persuaded, and this audience was too frightened to care about anyone else's performance. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and began walking forward with the measured pace of a man exercising a right he assumed he possessed. Colette intercepted him at row 9. "Sir, I need you to take your seat." He kept walking. "I understand there's a teenager flying this plane. I have a right to know what's being done. A passenger with aviation experience is working with air traffic control. Sir, sit down. I'm a ticket holder and I am not going to sit there while he stopped." Not because of Colette, though she hadn't moved. He stopped because Garrett Bowe was standing in the aisle in front of him. Garrett hadn't announced his presence. He hadn't raised his voice or made any particular gesture. He had simply stood up from row 6 and turned around, and now he was there, and the geometry was clear. He was built in a way that communicated something specific. 20 years of running into burning buildings had given him a physical vocabulary. The vocabulary of a man who decides what he's going to do and then does it without the internal negotiation most people conduct in the moment before action. He looked at Warren Cross and said without heat, "She's doing the job. Let her do it." Warren opened his mouth. Then he looked at Garrett more carefully, the set of his shoulders, the complete absence of performance in his face. No threat, no bravado. A man who had made a decision and was comfortable with it and was not going to revisit it. Warren closed his mouth. He stood there for 2 more seconds. Then he walked back to 8B and sat down. His hands, when he placed them on the armrests, were not quite steady. He noticed that and did not like it. Garrett Bowe sat back down in row 6, picked up his book, did not read it. In the cockpit, Sara did not know any of this was happening. She was running the instrument scan her father had drilled into her so many times it had become a rhythm, a background pulse altitude, heading airspeed, vertical speed, engine readings, fuel autopilot status. Then again. Desmond Falk's voice came back. "Sara, I want to start talking to you about what the next hour looks like." Ready. We're bringing you into O'Hare. Runway 14 left, our longest strip, and we've cleared it for you. You have approximately 90 minutes before we begin descent. For the next 45 minutes, the autopilot is your friend. Don't touch it. Use this time to get familiar with the controls. I'm going to walk you through the instrument panel layout so you can find things without hunting when we need them. Does that make sense? It makes sense. Good. Start with the mode control panel, the strip of controls directly above the primary flight display. "Tell me what you see," she told him. He walked her through it. She asked 2 questions, specific technical, about the relationship between the mode control panel settings and the autopilot hold functions, and Desmond answered them with the precision of someone who had been listening to how she asked and was calibrating accordingly. 20 minutes and Ray Holt's voice came through the interphone. "How's she doing?" "She asked the right questions," Desmond said. "She's ready for what comes next." A pause on the interphone. Then Ray, his voice quieter than before. "Her father was Air Force. I know." Another pause. "Tell her she's doing exactly what she should be doing." Sara heard this. She didn't respond, but she pressed 2 fingers to the silver wings on her hoodie and kept her eyes on the instruments. The first sign came at 47 minutes into the flight. It wasn't dramatic. The genuinely dangerous failures rarely are. They present as small anomalies. A reading that's off by a number that could be rounding error. A light that blinks once when it should be steady. A value trending slightly wrong over time, slow enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. Sara was paying attention. She keyed the transmit button. "Desmond." The nav hold annunciator just flickered. Half a second. Steady now, but it flickered. A brief pause. "Copy that. Keep watching it. Tell me if it happens again." She watched. 30 seconds. 45. It happened again, longer this time, almost a full second, and when it steadied, the course indicator had shifted 2 degrees right. It flickered again. The light came back. The correction was slightly off. "Desmond." Flickering again. Heading drifted to 087 when it came back. A longer pause. Sara listened carefully. The nav hold system uses a secondary power bus we believe was compromised by the same issue that affected the cockpit air system. "We've been monitoring it from here, and we're seeing exactly what you're seeing." She was already ahead of him. She felt it before he said it. "It's going to fail. It may." "Yes, within the next 20 to 30 minutes. Her eyes moved to the yoke, the real physical weight of it. If nav hold fails, autopilot still holds altitude and airspeed. It won't hold heading. The aircraft will drift. She knew this. "I'll have to fly it manually." "Yes, 40 minutes earlier than planned. But Sara, you can do it. We will walk you through every single step. You will not make decisions alone up there. Are you with me?" She looked at the panel. Altitude 30,000 feet. Heading already drifting slowly, barely, measurably, but drifting. She thought about her father in the simulator when she was 12. The simulated engine had cut out over simulated mountains, and she had frozen for 3 seconds, and he had said, not unkindly, "Sara, what are you doing?" She had said, "I don't know what to do." He had said, "Yes, you do. You've known for 10 minutes. Do it." She keyed the transmit button. "Tell me how." Desmond talked her through it step by step, and Ray Holt echoed through the interphone from 12A, the two of them overlapping and complementing each other in a way that was almost seamless. The man who knew the radio and the man who knew the cockpit, working either side of the problem with the quiet efficiency of people who understand that in an emergency, ego is a liability. When the nav hold failed, it failed without drama. The annunciator light went out. The heading indicator began drifting 3 degrees, then 4. Sara had her hands on the yoke. She corrected. The aircraft responded, heavier than anything she had ever handled, more alive than any simulator had prepared her for. In a simulator, the motion is approximated good enough to teach your mind the mechanics. But the yoke of an actual Boeing 737 in flight has the weight of air moving over 45,000 pounds of aircraft at 430 miles per hour behind it. And when you correct a heading drift by 2 degrees, you feel it. Not as effort exactly, as resistance, as conversation. The airplane is not inert. It has momentum and tendency and preference, and flying it is less about imposing will and more about understanding what it wants to do and working with that. Her father had spent years trying to give her that understanding in a small rented Cessna over the foothills. She had not known until this moment how completely she had received it. She made the correction, held the heading, made another small correction when it drifted again. After 5 minutes, Desmond Falk said, "You've got it," holding 085. "That's exactly where we want you." She didn't respond. She was concentrating. It was during this period, Sara at the controls, Ray monitoring from the cabin, the passengers sitting with the arithmetic of their own vulnerability, that First Officer Marcus Nash woke up. It happened slowly, the way people come back from places the body sends them to without consent. A sound from behind the cockpit door, faint and incoherent. Sara heard it first. She turned her head without releasing the yoke. Nash was moving. Not much. His head had tilted. His right hand had lifted slightly from his lap. His eyes were partially open. The oxygen mask on his face had shifted. Sara keyed the interphone to Colette. "The first officer is moving. Get in here." Colette was there in seconds. She adjusted Nash's oxygen mask, checked his pulse, watched his face. Nash's eyes opened fully. Unfocused the eyes of a man swimming up through deep water, moving around the cockpit with the confused scanning of someone trying to establish where they are and how they got there. His lips moved. Sara leaned toward him, kept one hand on the yoke, the other she pressed to the armrest between them. "Mr. Nash, can you hear me?" His head turned. He focused on her face. Something moved behind his eyes that might have been confusion and recognition simultaneously. He spoke, voice rough and degraded, each word costing him something. "Flap setting. Approach. Don't let speed go below 145. Below 145, she was already reaching for the pen in her pocket, writing on the back of her left hand, pressing hard enough that the ink would stay even if she sweated. He spoke again. "Don't fight the aircraft. It wants to fly. Let it." His eyes were going. She could see it. The effort was too much. The words coming from someplace training had put deep enough that even carbon monoxide poisoning couldn't reach it completely, but he was going back under. "One more thing." Barely audible. "Maintenance flag. 8 weeks. Tell them to look at the maintenance flag. 8 weeks back." Then his eyes closed. His breathing steadied. He was under again. Sara looked at her left hand. "Flap setting approach. No below 145. Main flag 8 weeks." She keyed the transmit button to Desmond. "First officer was conscious for approximately 90 seconds. He gave me approach speed guidance, 145 minimum on final. He also mentioned a maintenance flag, 8 weeks back." His words exactly. A pause on the other end that was different from the previous pauses, shorter but denser. "Copy that, Sara, all of it. We are noting everything. Keep that written where you can see it." She looked at her hand, keyed the interphone to Ray. You heard that Ray's voice came back immediately. Every word. The F-16s arrived at the 53-minute mark. She saw them before anyone announced them. Two shapes materializing from the blue periphery to the left banking, hard to match her heading and speed, with a precision that was almost disorienting. The way very exact things can be, disorienting when you're in a situation where precision feels far away. They settled into position off the wingtips, close enough to see, far enough to stay out of the wake turbulence. Flight 282. Desmond said you've been joined by two F-16 from the Illinois Air National Guard. They're your escort to O'Hare. They won't interfere. They're there to stay with you all the way down. Sara looked at the nearest jet through the cockpit window. She could see the pilot's helmet. The pilot raised one hand briefly, not a wave exactly, an acknowledgement, a statement of presence. She looked at those two gray shapes off her wingtips and understood something. This was the moment she had been moving towards since she sat down in Denver. The two F-16 Suez flanking a commercial jet over Illinois, the sun on their fuselages, everything in the balance. She had not known 4 hours ago at Gate C-11 that she would be here. She knew it now. There was no version of today that she could step back from. There was only forward. She turned back to the instruments and held the heading. In the cabin, passengers pressed faces to windows. Someone said quietly, "Those are fighter jets." Someone else said, "I know." A woman reached across the empty seat beside her and took the hand of the man on the other side. He didn't pull away. Ray Holt watched the F-16 out the window of 12A. He had spent 30 years talking to military aircraft. He knew what their presence meant. You don't scramble jets for a situation you've already written off. He pressed the interphone button. "Sara, you've got company out there. I see them." "Good. Don't look at them. Eyes on the panel. I know." He almost smiled. Garrett Bowe watched the F-16 through the window over the empty seat beside him. He had known a few military guys in the fire department. He understood what that kind of commitment communicated. "We believe there is something on this plane worth bringing home." Warren Cross looked out the window and said nothing. He was no longer on his phone. He hadn't been since Garrett Bowe had stood in the aisle in front of him, and he wasn't sure he was going to pick it up again for a while. He was thinking about something he didn't have comfortable language for, about what he had assumed when he saw that girl walk toward the cockpit, and what he had been wrong about, and what the difference between those two things cost. The false summit came at 61 minutes into the flight at 21,000 feet, and it nearly broke her. Not physically. The aircraft was stable. She was descending on instructions, the autopilot maintaining altitude hold, while she managed the heating manually descent, proceeding exactly as Desmond had outlined, 800 feet per minute, steady, controlled, methodical. She had found her rhythm. That was the thing. After 40 minutes of manual heading control, her hands had found the feel of the yoke in a way they hadn't at the beginning. Her instrument scan had settled into something almost automatic. She was holding 085 within a degree, catching drift before it developed, making corrections that were getting smoother and smaller as her feel for the aircraft built. She was in the truest sense flying, and for one moment, just one somewhere around 21,000 feet, as Chicago began to appear on the distant horizon, like a suggestion in the haze, she let herself think this is going to be okay. That was when the radio died. Not static, not interference, clean silence. The silence of a frequency that has gone completely dark. Sara keyed the transmit button. Desmond, do you copy? Nothing. She switched to the guard frequency. Nothing. She tried 3 other frequencies in sequence. Nothing on any of them. Flight 282, do you copy? Anyone? This is Sara Cole, Flight 282. Please respond. Silence. She sat with it for 10 seconds. Counted them. In the interphone, Ray's voice, Sara, I just lost radio up here too. Cabin interphone system just went down. I'm going to keep trying. Don't change anything. Hold heading. Hold descent rate. Then the interphone went silent as well. Sara Cole was alone. Not alone in the aircraft. 147 people were breathing behind her, and 2 unconscious men were to her left. Not alone in the sky. 2 Air Force pilots were flanking her 30 yards off each wingtip. But alone in the way that matters when you are flying an aircraft, and the voices that have been guiding you go quiet alone inside the decision space of the cockpit. She looked at the instrument panel, altitude 20,800, heading 086 drifting a degree, speed 380 knots, descent rate 800 feet per minute. She corrected the heading. She held the descent rate. She kept her eyes moving. In the cabin, Colette heard the radio system go down and felt her stomach drop. Ray was on his feet, trying the interphone at 3 different points, coming up silent at everyone. The cabin murmur shifted in register. People felt it the way you feel a pressure change, not something you can point to, but something that moves through you. Warren Cross gripped the armrest and stared at the back of the seat in front of him. Garrett Bowe did not move. He looked at the cockpit door still open a few inches. He looked at it for a long time. Ray Holt stood at his seat with the dead handset pressed to his ear, and for the first time in this entire sequence, he felt something he did not want to feel. He felt afraid. Not for himself. He was 62 years old and had lived a full life. He felt afraid for the girl in the cockpit alone up there with a dead radio and whatever was happening inside her own head, and there was nothing he could do about any of it. He stood with the dead handset and watched the cockpit door. Inside the cockpit, Sara's hands were on the yoke, and her eyes were on the instruments, and her mind was doing something she hadn't anticipated. It was talking to her. Not the useful part, not the trained, scanning, reporting, responding part. The other part, the part that had been waiting with considerable patience for a moment of silence in which to make itself heard. You asked him to drive that night, she corrected the heading. 085, hold it, if you hadn't asked him. If you'd called someone else. If you'd just taken the bus. Descent rate steady, 800 feet per minute. You know what you did. And now you're going to kill everyone on this plane because you are not a pilot. You are a 17-year-old girl who read her dead father's books, and that is not the same thing. That has never been the same thing. The heading drifted to 087. She caught it, brought it back. She looked at her left hand. The ink from the pen was smearing at the edges, but the numbers were still readable. She looked at the silver wings on her hoodie, and she heard something. Not a memory exactly, something quieter and more specific than memory. The thing that remains after a person is gone and the people they shaped. Not words, not the specific sentence her father had said in that simulator long ago. Something underneath the words. Something he had been trying to give her across all those Sunday mornings in a rented Cessna over the Colorado foothills, across all those margin notes in blue ink, across all the quizzes and the checklists and the patient repetition of a man who knew that the real thing he was teaching had nothing to do with airspeed or altitude. He was teaching her that she was capable. Not that she was special, not that she was exceptional. That she was capable, which is a different thing, a more durable thing, a thing that survives the moments when special and exceptional feel very far away. She looked at the artificial horizon, level. She looked at the vertical speed indicator, steady descent. She looked at the altimeter, 19,200 feet counting down in the right direction. The aircraft was flying. She was flying it. She corrected a small heading drift, held 800 feet per minute, kept her eyes moving. She did not cry. There was no room for it. The radio came back after 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Static returned first. Then Desmond Falk's voice, exactly as it had always been, the same level professional, unhurried steadiness as if nothing had interrupted it. Sara, we lost comms for a few minutes. We're back. Report status. She looked at the instrument panel, at her hands on the yoke, altitude 18,600 feet, heading 085, descent rate 800, speed 340. I held it. A pause. Shorter than the ones before, I know you did. We were watching you on radar. You held it the whole time. She didn't say anything to that. Rayholt's voice came through the interphone, also restored. Sarah, here. A longer pause than she expected from a man who had always been economical with silence. He said your father would be... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sara Cole looked out the cockpit window. Below and ahead, through the thinning cloud layer, Chicago was coming into view. The geometry of it, the lake blue and enormous running to the horizon, the grid of streets, the thin gray lines of runways at O'Hare precise and narrow from this distance, promising and terrifying in equal measure. She tightened her grip on the yoke. Desmond, what do I do next? We bring you home, Desmond Falk said. Let's talk about your approach. 18,000 feet, 147 people breathing, 2 F-16 holding formation, one girl with a dead man's wings on her chest in a pen-marked hand, and a yoke she was genuinely carefully flying. The ground was coming, 18,000 feet. Desmond Falk's voice was in her ear, and Chicago was in the windscreen, and the ground was no longer abstract. That was the thing about descent. At 30,000 feet, the earth below is a concept, a pattern, something at a theoretical remove. But as the altimeter counts down 17,000, 16,000, 15,000, the concept becomes a place. Streets resolve out of the grid. The lake finds its edges. The runway at O'Hare talked about and planned around for the last hour stops being coordinates and becomes a physical fact, a long gray strip of asphalt pointing at her through the afternoon haze waiting. Sarah Desmond said, "You're looking good on descent. We're going to take this in stages. No rush. You have altitude and time, and we're going to use both correctly." Understood. Understood. First thing, reduce speed to 250 knots. Pull the throttle levers back gently. They're the 2 black handles on the center console. You've already found them. Don't yank them. Ease them. The aircraft will tell you when it's right. She put her right hand on the throttle levers. Felt them. She had touched them before during the familiarization walkthrough Desmond had run her through 40 minutes earlier. But touching them now was different because the altitude was 14,000 feet and the runway was visible and the throttles were connected to engines that were connected to 147 lives. She eased them back. The engine's change register a subtle shift in note, a slight lessening of the forward pressure she'd been feeling through the airframe. The airspeed indicator walked backward. 380, 350, 310, 280, 260, 252, 250, Desmond said. Hold it there. 250 confirmed. Good. Flaps to position 5. The dial is to the right of the throttle quadrant. Turn it to 5. The aircraft is going to feel different. That's normal. Hold your heading and let it settle. She found the flap dial, turned it to 5. The airframe shifted in a way that was unlike anything she had felt before, a slight nose-up tendency, a change in the quality of air moving over the wings as if the aircraft had just renegotiated its relationship with the atmosphere. She held the heading, let it settle. It settled. In the cabin, Colette Marsh stood at the front and watched her passengers with the attention of someone whose job had become something different from what it was this morning. She had 12 years of service, emergencies, and medical situations, and severe turbulence, and none of it had looked like this. None of it had required her to stand in an aircraft and watch 147 people sit with the knowledge of their possible death and decide each of them privately and without consultation what to do with it. Most of them had decided to be still. That was what surprised her. She had expected something closer to panic. What she got instead was the particular stillness of people who have run out of options and found on the other side of that something resembling peace. A woman in the middle section held a rosary, lips moving silently. The man beside her looked out the window at the F-16 off the wing and said nothing. Near the rear, 2 college-age boys who had spent the first hour playing cards were now simply sitting shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close. The little boy near the front had fallen asleep against his mother's arm. She had not moved in 40 minutes. Rayholt sat in 12A with the interphone handset in his lap and his eyes closed. Not sleeping, listening. The particular focused attention of a man trained to parse sound for information, running everything he heard from the cockpit through 30 years of pattern recognition. The throttle reduction. The flap extension. The small heading corrections she was still making with a consistency he found honestly remarkable. Garrett Bowe sat in row 6. He had not moved except once, and he wasn't going to move again unless he had to. He watched the cockpit door. Warren Cross sat in 8B with his jacket off and his tie loosened. He was looking at the window. He had not picked up his phone in over an hour. He was thinking about the moment he had stood up and walked toward the cockpit, and about the calculation he had made when he saw Sara Cole walk past him in the aisle, and about how completely that calculation had been wrong. He was not a man who was often wrong in ways that had consequences, and this wrongness had a weight to it that he was going to be carrying for some time. He looked at the F-16 off the wing and thought about what it meant that those pilots were still out there. That the Air Force had sent an escort and was holding formation for a commercial jet being flown by a teenager. He thought about what that said about what they believed was possible. He thought about how quickly he had believed the opposite. He looked out the window and did not have any comfortable place to put that thought, so he just held it. 10,000 feet. Sarah's world had narrowed to the width of the instrument panel, and the sound in her headset and the feel of the yoke in her hands. The scan had become automatic altitude heading, airspeed vertical speed, engine readouts, fuel autopilot status. Then again in the rhythm her father had spent 7 years drilling into her in a rented Cessna over the Colorado foothills. That rhythm was now doing something that felt inside the compressed clarity of this cockpit like the most natural thing she had ever done. She was not comfortable, not calm in the way people who have never been frightened imagine calm to be. Her hands were wet, her jaw was tight, her pulse was audible in her own ears. But she was steady, and in the geography of what was happening, steady was what mattered. Desmond walked her through the approach sequence in pieces, not all at once. He had understood early that the way to keep her functional was not to give her the whole picture. The whole picture was too large, but to give her the next step and trust her to execute each one before asking for the following. He had calibrated to her in the way the best controllers calibrate to whoever they're working with. He had read her voice and her response times in the specificity of her readbacks, and he had adjusted accordingly. She was, he thought, in the part of his mind that continued to assess, while the professional part continued to transmit. She was doing something that most people cannot do under any conditions. She was keeping her thinking organized, while her body was saturated with adrenaline. That was the skill. That was the one that training was actually for. The technical knowledge could be learned in a week. The ability to use it when everything was on fire that took years, or in some people, a kind of upbringing that was indistinguishable from years. 8,000 feet. Flaps to position 15, Desmond said. Flaps 15, Sara confirmed. The airframe shifted again. The nose behavior changed. The aircraft was slowing in a way that felt different from the throttle reduction, more structural, as if it was borrowing surface area from the wings and using it against its own forward momentum. Begin gear deployment, Desmond said. The gear lever is to your right. It will have a wheel icon. Pull it down. She found it. Pulled. The aircraft shuddered, a deep mechanical vibration moving through the airframe from the belly up the landing gear, rotating out of its wells and locking into position, 3 struts reaching down into the cold air below the fuselage. The shudder lasted 4 seconds. Stopped. She checked the gear indicator panel. 3 green lights. Gear down and locked. 3 greens confirmed. Good. Looking great, Sara. Altitude 6,800. Runway should be visible. Tell me what you see. She looked up from the instruments and out through the windscreen. The runway was there, not an abstraction, not coordinates. The actual physical runway, runway 14 left at Chicago O'Hare, 11,000 feet of concrete laid out in a straight line below and ahead of her, its threshold lights visible even in the afternoon sun, the precision approach path indicator showing 2 white over 2 red exactly where she was supposed to be. On either side of the runway, emergency vehicles were lined up as far as she could see. Fire trucks, crash, tenders, ambulances. Their lights cycling red and yellow foam suppression units positioned at intervals. She understood what they were there for. She did not allow herself to think about it. I've got visual on the runway. Good. Keep it in sight, but keep scanning the instruments. Don't fixate on the runway. Trust your instruments. They won't lie to you. She pulled her eyes back to the panel. Then the runway. Then the panel. 4,000 feet. The city was real now. It filled the periphery of the windscreen buildings and roads, and the late afternoon sun laying long shadows across everything, and beyond it, the lake enormous and steel blue and indifferent. She had been to Chicago once before when she was 12 and had looked at Lake Michigan from the shore and thought it looked like an ocean. From up here, it did too. From up here, almost everything looked like what it actually was, stripped of the small, accumulated stories that made ground level complicated. Reduce speed to 190, Desmond said. Flaps to 20. She adjusted. The aircraft slowed further. The nose attitude changed. 3,000 feet. 2,000. At 800 feet, the engine failed. Not completely. Not both. Engine number 2. The right side engine began losing power. Not catastrophically, but measurably suddenly without warning. The thrust asymmetry happened in less than a second, a hard yaw to the left, as the right engine's contribution dropped the aircraft rolling left, the nose beginning to drift off the runway centerline. Sarah felt it before any alarm sounded. The yoke pulled against her. The aircraft wanted to go left. She heard Desmond in her ear, his voice the same as it had always been, except faster, professional calm, sharpened to a point, engine 2 partial failure. Right rudder now. Right rudder, push the right rudder pedal. Her foot was already moving. 30 years of her father's instruction, compacted and stored and available, and her foot found the right rudder pedal and pushed it and held it, and the nose began to come back. Not instantly, not without effort, but it came. She was fighting the yoke right with both hands and holding the right rudder pedal, and the aircraft was swinging back toward the centerline degree by degree, the runway lights that had been sliding left beginning to center again. In the cabin, the lurch was unmistakable. People who had been still gasped and cried out. A bag fell from an overhead bin. Colette grabbed the forward bulkhead. Garrett Bowe pressed his feet flat to the floor. The little boy woke up and started crying. Ray Holt had the interphone pressed to his ear. When he heard the engine alarm and felt the yaw, he closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them. He pressed the transmit button. He said the only thing he had left to give her. "Your father's hands, Sarah. Use your father's hands." She heard it. She didn't know what her face did. She knew what her hands did. They held the yoke back, right? Holding the correction, holding the center line, holding the aircraft in its conversation with the air. That was the only thing between 147 people and the earth. 500 feet, runway straight ahead, center line, approach lights clear and unambiguous. Desmond's voice engine, 2 is partial, not gone. "You have thrust. You're on center line. Hold the correction and bring it down." She held the correction. 300 feet. The ground was coming up faster than she had expected, faster than any simulator had rendered it. The runway threshold lights passed beneath her at 200 feet, and she was over the numbers, the white painted numbers at the threshold end of 14, left, and Desmond said, "Flare at 50 feet. Ease back on the yoke, smooth. Don't rush it, smooth." She watched the radio altimeter, 150, 100, 70, 50, 50. She eased back on the yoke. The nose rose. The sink rate slowed. The aircraft flared that particular moment at the end of every landing. The controlled decrease of descent rate that turns a controlled fall into something that deserves to be called an arrival. The main gear touched the runway. It was hard and real, and the aircraft bounced a single decisive bounce. The left main gear coming down a fraction before the right because she was still holding the right rudder correction and the yaw wasn't fully resolved. And for 1 second, the aircraft was back in the air 6 feet above the concrete boundary lights, going past on either side and the overrun zone ahead. She held the yoke, held the correction. Held. The aircraft came down again. Both mains this time. The impact went up through the airframe and through the seat and through her spine, and she felt it in her back teeth. The nose gear came down a second later, a concussive slam that sent a shudder through every row and drew from the passengers a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a gasp, the involuntary vocal release of people who have held everything in and suddenly can't anymore. The tires screeched. The aircraft was rolling fast. "Brakes," Desmond said. "Both feet. Easy. Progressive." She pressed the brake pedals, not hard. Progressive, the way her father had taught her. Let the deceleration build. Don't make something that's going well go badly. The aircraft slowed. Emergency vehicles ran alongside on the taxiway, matching her speed, their lights cycling. The aircraft slowed and stopped. 1,100 feet from the far end of runway 14, left flight 282 came to a complete stop. 3 seconds of absolute silence. No engines. The thrust reversers had run their course and the engines were spooling down. No alarms. No voices. The radio had gone quiet in a way that felt like respect. Just the tick of a cooling airframe and the sound of 147 people breathing. Then from somewhere in the rear of the cabin, in a voice that cracked on every syllable, she did it. The cabin broke open. Not into screaming, into something that had no name, but was the complete emotional opposite of everything the last 2 hours had been. People were crying and clapping, and the sound of it came through the cockpit door and filled the space around Sarah like water filling a room, and she sat in the first officer's seat with her hands still on the yoke and her feet still on the rudder pedals. Her body was still running the emergency, still holding every circuit at peak output. It would be some time before those circuits understood that the emergency was over. She looked at the instrument panel. Engine stopped. Altitude 0. Airspeed 0. Everything that had been dynamic and demanding and alive for the last hour and 40 minutes was still. She looked at her left hand. The writing on the back of it was smeared almost to illegibility, blurred by sweat and pressure. But she could still read the numbers. 145. She had never let the speed go below 145. She reached up and unclipped the silver wings from her hoodie, held them in her palm for a moment, felt the weight of them lighter than you'd expect for something that had carried so much. She reached forward and set them gently on top of the instrument panel against the lower edge of the windscreen, where the afternoon light was coming through from the west. She said quietly to a man who was not there, "I heard you the whole way." She did not cry. She had thought she might, but she didn't. What happened instead was quieter. The absence of the thing she had been carrying. Not gone, grief doesn't leave like that, but set down the way you set down something heavy at the end of a long walk, knowing you'll pick it up again, knowing it's yours to carry, but resting for a moment in the plain fact of having made it here. Colette Marsh appeared in the cockpit doorway. She took in the scene, both pilots still in their seats. Oxygen masks in place, paramedics moving up the jetway, already being positioned against the aircraft. Sara in the first officer's seat, hands finally off the yoke, settling into her lap. The silver wings on the instrument panel, the writing on the back of Sara's hand. She stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then the paramedics are coming for the pilots. "Are you okay?" Sara thought about the question honestly. "I think I need a minute. Take as many as you need." The paramedics came and went with the efficiency of people who are very good at their jobs. Captain Alan Reeves and First Officer Marcus Nash were removed from the cockpit on gurneys and taken down the jetway to waiting ambulances. Both were breathing adequately. Both showed elevated carbon monoxide markers. Both required hospital observation and treatment, and both would, in the days that followed, make full recoveries. Nash, when he was alert enough to speak in full sentences on the fourth day, asked the NTSB investigator, sitting at his bedside, did they find it? The investigator said, "Find what Mr. Nash said, the maintenance flag. 8 weeks before the flight, I filed it on that aircraft's air circulation system. They deferred it. I kept a copy because I didn't trust the institutional copy to survive the deferral process. It's in a manila folder in the second drawer of my desk at home behind the lease renewal paperwork. That's where I put it. Sara Cole told you from the cockpit to look for it. Before she knew anything about any of it, she told you. Now go look." The NTSB found the folder that afternoon. They also found inside Horizon Air's internal maintenance database the original deferral approval memo, time-stamped, 6 weeks before Flight 282 departed Denver, $2.1 million to repair. Deferred on a budget authorization signed by 3 members of senior management. A calculation made in a conference room by people who had determined that the probability of catastrophic failure was low enough to justify the cost savings. Nash had filed the flag. He had been overruled. He had kept his copy. He had told the investigator. It was the least inadequate thing available to him, and he knew it, and he was going to carry the 8 weeks of silence before the flight for a long time, regardless of what happened next. The passengers disembarked through the forward door onto a jetway, surrounded by airport emergency personnel, and at the far end of the terminal, the particular dense human crowd that forms wherever something historic has happened, and people who understand they are witnessing it have gathered. Many of the passengers said nothing as they passed the cockpit door. Some looked in, some pressed their hand to their chest. An older woman stopped and pressed her palm flat against the fuselage of the aircraft itself at the point where the cabin wall met the doorframe, as if the gesture could say what words couldn't reach. Garrett Bowe was among the last to leave. He stopped at the cockpit door. Sara was still in the first officer's seat, a silver emergency blanket around her shoulders that she didn't remember anyone putting there. She looked up. He said, 20 years in the fire department. I've seen maybe 3 people do what you did today. She looked at him. He said, your dad did a good job. He nodded once and went. Warren Cross was the last passenger off the aircraft. He had been standing at the end of the jetway for almost a full minute before he turned back, letting the other passengers move past him, trying to locate something, a word, a framework, some organizing principle that would let him file what had happened today into a category he already had. He couldn't find one. The categories he carried, competence, authority, credibility, the visible markers of someone worth trusting, had all predicted the wrong outcome. He had looked at a 17-year-old girl in a dark hoodie and calculated in the automatic way he calculated most things that she was not the answer. He had done this calculation quickly and without examination, and he had been wrong in a way that had weight to it. He walked back to the cockpit door. Sara looked at him. She recognized him. She had seen him in the aisle when things went sideways in the cabin, though she hadn't known the details of what happened. Warren Cross stood in the doorway and said, "I was wrong about you. I want you to know I know that." She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze without looking away, which cost him something. She nodded. He went. Ray Holt was last. He had waited while everyone else deplaned. He stood in the cockpit doorway and looked at her in the seat, and she looked at him, and between them was everything that had happened in the last hour and 40 minutes, too much to talk about, too important not to acknowledge. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, held it out. She took it. He said, "You should get your certificate, the proper one, when you're ready." She held the card. He said it would be a waste if you didn't. He turned and walked up the jetway. Sara Cole sat alone in the cockpit of Flight 282 for the last time, with the silver wings on the instrument panel and the afternoon light coming through the windscreen and the sound of Chicago outside the aircraft, alive and enormous and completely indifferent to what had just happened, the way cities always are. What came next was not the clean, clear aftermath that crisis stories tend to produce in the telling. What came next was complicated, the way things that are real are complicated, and it took months. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation opened within hours and had a focus within 48 hours, the cockpit air circulation system. The maintenance flag Nash had described to the investigator at his bedside was found that afternoon. The deferral memo was found the following morning. The names on the deferral approval were not difficult to locate. The Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Aviation Safety convened hearings 3 months after the incident. Several Horizon Air executives were called to testify. Several FAA oversight officials were called, and Sara Cole, 17 years old, was asked to appear. Her family's attorney advised against it. The risk of re-exposure, of being made a piece of a political process that would use her story and move on. Sara listened to all of it. She understood it. A week before the scheduled hearing, a senior attorney representing Horizon Air's board requested a private meeting. It was held in a conference room at a Denver law firm. Sara and her mother attended with their own attorney. The Horizon Air attorney was polished and careful. He spent the first 15 minutes explaining the complexity of aviation maintenance regulatory frameworks before arriving at what he had come to say. He said the airline wanted to reach a resolution that honored Sara's experience without the additional difficulty of a public proceeding. He described a substantial financial settlement, a full academic scholarship to any university in the country. In exchange, Horizon Air asked only that Sara's testimony to the Senate subcommittee be limited in scope, specifically that she not reference the maintenance deferral process or the internal documents relating to the filtration system. He framed it as protection. He framed it as giving Sara her life back. Sara looked at him across the conference table. She had the Cessna manual in her lap. She had brought it without quite knowing why, the way you bring something that orients you when the world is trying to disorient you. She said those documents are why 2 pilots were unconscious at 30,000 feet. The attorney said the regulatory and legal questions around those documents were being addressed through appropriate channels. Sara said, "I heard a man describe those documents from the cockpit of a plane I was trying not to crash." He said it with some of his last conscious words. "I'm testifying." The attorney said he hoped she would reconsider for her own well-being. She picked up her bag. The meeting was over. The Senate hearing room was large and formal, and designed to communicate the weight of the institution, which Sara found less intimidating than she had expected, possibly because she had recently landed a Boeing 737 with a partial engine failure and a dead radio, and her father's instructions written on the back of her hand. She sat at the witness table in a dark blazer over a plain shirt. She had declined the offer of professional styling from someone on the committee's communications staff. She looked like what she was. She was asked to describe what happened on Flight 282. She described it. She was asked about her training and experience. She described it. She was asked what First Officer Nash had said into the cockpit. She told them clearly and without embellishment, and she held up her left hand, the writing long gone, but the gesture carrying its own meaning. She was asked what she thought should happen to prevent a similar incident. She said maintenance deferrals that affect life safety systems should require authorization from someone who will board the aircraft in question. That's it. That's the whole standard. A senator said that's a very simple standard. Sara said most important things are. Over the months that followed, Horizon Air's CEO resigned. 3 senior executives faced federal referrals. The FAA issued a formal policy revision requiring independent safety review of life safety maintenance deferrals, the first such revision in 11 years. Sara went back to school, finished her junior year, took her exams. She declined nearly every interview request, and the ones she didn't decline, she kept short and factual. She was not interested in being a symbol or a story. She was aware that other people had a need to make her one, and had some sympathy for that need, but it was not her need. She was interested in flying. She started formal instruction with a certified flight instructor at the same small airfield east of Denver, where her father had taken her in the Cessna. The instructor was a retired crop duster pilot named Frank Aldridge, 67 years old with no interest in Sara Cole's story and a great deal of interest in whether she could maintain coordinated flight through a series of steep turns and a crosswind. She liked him immediately. He put her through the primary maneuvers with the methodical thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why. She was competent. He did not tell her that. He made her prove it repeatedly and in varying conditions. She didn't mind. Proving things was the point. On a bright September morning, 3 months after the Senate hearing, Sara Cole flew her first official supervised solo in the Cessna. She had done it before, in the informal, undocumented way her father had arranged, sliding over to the left seat while he sat on the ground beside the runway and watched with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the expression that meant he was paying attention to everything and showing nothing. She had done it half a dozen times in that way, but this was the official version, the log version, the one that would go on a record and contribute toward a certificate. Frank Aldridge had run her through the pre-solo checklist 3 times that morning and found nothing wrong, which was his way of saying she was ready, which he had not said directly because he had not said it directly to any student in 40 years of instructing and was not going to start now. He got out of the aircraft, closed the door, stepped back. Sara sat alone in the left seat of the Cessna 172. She looked at the panel in front of her. Simple compared to the 737. Every instrument visible and legible. The kind of cockpit her father had loved precisely because it was honest, it showed you everything and hid nothing and asked only that you pay attention. She reached into her jacket and took out the silver wings. She held them for a moment in the morning light. The worn edges, the soft places where decades of contact had taken the brightness down to something warmer and more lasting than brightness. She had been carrying them since the morning her mother pinned them to her hoodie in Denver International 5 months ago. She had taken them off in the cockpit of the 737 and set them on the instrument panel, and then picked them up again when the paramedics came, and she had kept them since. She pinned them to her jacket, just above the left pocket. She ran the checklist. Engine start, oil pressure confirmed, instruments alive, throttle set, radio call made to the traffic pattern. She taxied to the runway. At the hold short line, she paused the way her father had always paused, not from hesitation, from intention, from the habit of taking one moment to confirm that you have decided consciously and specifically to do this, that you are not going through motions, that you are choosing. She chose. The throttle went in, the Cessna accelerated. At 65 knots, the wheels came off the grass because that is what the aircraft was built to do, and because Sara led it the way her father had taught her over years of Sunday mornings and blue ink in the margins of a worn spiral-bound manual. Not fighting it, not forcing it, helping it do what it already wanted to do. She climbed. 500 feet. 1,000. The airfield fell away. The foothills appeared to the west, their shapes as familiar as the back of her hand. The Denver skyline to the northwest, the plains stretching east into a distance that had no visible end. She leveled off at pattern altitude and flew the rectangle. Downwind. Base. Final. Frank Aldridge stood beside the runway with his arms crossed and his sunglasses on. He had watched a lot of students fly their first solos. He had felt a version of this particular held breath, this weight of watching something that mattered more times than he could count. It still got to him every time. He had never told anyone that. Sara flew the pattern cleanly. Her turns were coordinated. Her airspeeds were correct. She crossed the threshold at 65 knots and held the flare and the mains touch with the gentleness of someone who had learned that a landing is not something you do to an aircraft, but something you do with it. She rolled out, turned off the runway. She sat in the aircraft for a moment with the engine running and her hands in her lap. The September morning was bright and still, and the Cessna rocked very gently in the light air moving across the field, and somewhere above her a hawk was making slow circles in the blue. This was nothing like O'Hare. There were no F-16 some, no emergency vehicles lining the runway. No 147 people in the seats behind her. No radio voice in her ear talking her through every step. No one watching except a 67-year-old crop duster pilot standing on the grass with his arms crossed. And it was better, not more significant, not more historic. Better in the way that things you have chosen purely for their own sake are better than things you were required to do. This was hers. The 737 had been history. This was flying. She looked down at the silver wings on her jacket. She thought about her father. Not the image of him from the accident report, or the closed casket service, or the framed photograph on the shelf at home. The actual him, the man who had slid a Cessna manual across the kitchen table when she was 10 years old and said, "Read this," with the absolute unsentimentality of a person who gives a gift by expecting the recipient to be capable of receiving it. She thought about what he had been trying to give her all those years. Not the technical knowledge, though he had given her that too carefully and completely. Something underneath it. Something about herself that she was only now beginning to understand fully. He had not believed she was exceptional. He had believed she was capable. And he had treated those two things as identical, which is the truest thing a parent can do. She taxied back to the apron, shut down the engine. Frank Aldridge was there when she opened the door. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That was a good landing," which from him was a complete sentence, and she knew it, and she accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. Sara climbed out and stood on the apron in the morning light and looked up at the sky. It was the same sky it always was, immense clear, full of the kind of promise that requires nothing from you except the willingness to enter it. It would be there tomorrow and the day after, indifferent to her schedule, indifferent to her history, indifferent to the fact that 5 months ago she had done something over Illinois that people were still talking about in committee rooms and editorial pages and late-night conversations between strangers who had seen the news and wondered what they would have done. She was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about next week's lesson, about the maneuvers Frank had told her they would work on, about the hours she needed to log before she could sit for the written exam, about the practical test and the oral, and the moment still months away, but already real to her, already a thing she was flying toward, when someone would hand her a certificate with her name on it, and she would be officially and permanently a pilot. She was not thinking about the Boeing, not about the Senate hearing or the FAA revision or the Horizon Air executives or the documentary that someone in Los Angeles was apparently developing. Those things had happened. They were true. They were hers in the sense that they were part of her history, the way the accident was part of her history, the way the guilt was part of her history, permanent, carried, integrated. But they were not the point. The point was the sky. Ray Holt had said at a press conference 2 days after the landing, when a reporter asked him who the real hero of Flight 282 was, Captain Daniel Cole. He taught his daughter that duty is not something you perform when it's convenient. She was just being her father's daughter when the moment needed it most. That's all. That's everything. Sara had read those words. She had read them more than once in the quiet of her room late at night when the house was still. She thought about them now on the apron of a small airfield east of Denver, with the September morning open around her and a hawk somewhere above making its slow circles. She thought, "I know, Dad." She picked up her bag. She walked back toward the hangar. She scheduled her next lesson for the following Thursday because the weather was supposed to be clear, and she didn't want to lose a good day. She did not look back at the sky. She didn't need to. She knew it was there. She had always known it was there. She was her father's daughter, and she was going to fly.